June 4th, 1942, 5:52 a.m. The radar shack on Sand Island was a tomb of warm metal and stale coffee, humming with the sound of the new world. Ensign Jack Reed, a math whiz from Iowa with eyes scratchy from a 12-hour shift, watched the green glow of the scope. The sweep line pulsed, a lazy lighthouse beam searching an empty electronic sea. Static. Always the static. In the corner, Lieutenant Commander Harlan Brickman sipped cold coffee from a Navy-issue mug. He was all sharp angles and perpetual stubble, a career officer worn thin by a year of relentless bad news. He'd seen the decoded intercepts, knew the Japanese fleet was coming. Everyone in the shack knew. Admiral Nimitz knew. It was the worst-kept secret in the Pacific, a trap set with trembling hands. Brickman's job was to wait for the hammer to fall. Sweep. Static. Sweep. Then, it wasn't static. A faint smudge, a cluster of pale green pixels blooming at the very edge of the screen, 180 miles out, bearing 320 degrees, northwest. Jack's finger froze on the console. He blinked. The smudge remained, a faint heartbeat on the glass, distant, massive. "Sir." Brickman didn't look up. "If it's another weather front, Reed, I swear to God." "Bogies, multiple bogies, 320 degrees, range 180 miles. The mug stopped midair. Brickman was across the small room in 3 strides, his shadow falling over the scope. He bent close. His breath smelled of tobacco and fatigue. The smudge had texture now. It wasn't a cloud. It was a formation. "Christ," he whispered. The word wasn't fear. It was recognition. The hammer. Right on time, right where intelligence said it would be. The air in the shack changed. It tightened, crystallized. The young radioman by the door tensed, his hand hovering over the alarm switch. The protocol was simple, drilled into them 1,000 times. Sound the alarm, scramble the fighters, get the bombers off the ground before they were sitting ducks. Jack looked at Brickman. "Should I—" "Wait." The word cut through the hum. Brickman didn't take his eyes off the screen. Inside his head, 2 tracks collided. Track 1 was the manual, the obvious move. Sound the alarm, save lives, execute the perfect defense they'd planned for. Track 2 was a ghost, the ghost of December 7th, the memory of another radar contact, another young operator, another officer who dismissed a blip as a flight of friendly B-17s. The shame of crying wolf, the fear of looking like a panicked fool in front of the hotshot aviators who thought the surface navy was made of dinosaurs. And a colder tactical thought, 180 miles. The Japanese strike aircraft had a range of about 250. They were still out of range. If he scrambled everything now, his fighters would be circling, burning precious fuel, waiting. What if this was a feint, a decoy? What if the main force was coming from another direction entirely? He'd leave the island naked. "It's too far," Brickman said, his voice a low growl of decision. "We need visual confirmation. I am not turning this island into a circus for a radar ghost. Not again." The gap opened right there, in that dark room. Jack saw data, an unambiguous advancing threat. Brickman saw history, and the terrifying weight of being the man who pushed the first domino. The boy saw the blip. The officer saw the consequences. "Sir, the intelligence." "The intelligence said they were coming," Brickman snapped, the ghost winning. "It didn't say they'd send a greeting card at 180 miles. We wait." He turned to the radio man. "Send a flash message to SyncPack. Radar contact, multiple bogies, awaiting visual confirmation. And get me the airfield command post, quietly." Jack stared at the screen. The smudge grew. It crept toward the center of the scope, a slow green cancer. He watched it for 10 eternal minutes, saying nothing, as Brickman argued in tense, low tones on the field phone with a squadron commander who was pleading to launch. On the airfield, pilots sat in their cockpits, engines cold, watching the silent sky. The dawn was beautiful, a bruised purple bleeding into gold. They didn't know about the blip. They just felt the weight. At 6:30, the range was 150 miles. The formation had split into distinct groups. Jack couldn't stay silent. "They've launched, sir. Look at the dispersion. That's an attack wave." Brickman looked. The evidence was now a verdict. The ghost of Pearl screamed, but it was drowned out by the screaming truth on the glass. The moment for a perfect high-altitude interception was gone. He had chosen. His voice was hollow. "Sound the general alarm." The sirens wailed to life, a rising, urgent shriek that tore the morning apart. Wildcats coughed and sputtered, then roared down the runway. Bombers, laden with fuel and ordnance, lumbered into the sky, not to attack, but to flee, to get clear of the bullseye now painted on their home. But they were late. The window had shrunk. 7 miles above the Pacific, the world was a featureless blue. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bomber squadron from the USS Enterprise, was lost. Truly, dangerously lost. His fuel gauge was a sinking heart. The coordinates they'd been given were empty ocean. The Japanese fleet had to be here, but it wasn't. He had minutes, maybe seconds of decision left. Turn back and risk ditching in the sea, or push on a hunch, into the void. He chose the void. He banked his SBD Dauntless to the northwest, a gut decision, a prayer thrown into the wind. Behind him, 30 other pilots followed, their trust in him a physical weight. They flew into blankness, their only company the dwindling numbers on their fuel gauges. On the deck of the Japanese flagship Akagi, the mood was one of focused fury, edged with a puzzling tension. The first strike on Midway had gone in. Reports were radioing back. The island was damaged, but not destroyed. The American bombers had been surprisingly absent, a nuisance, not a threat. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, receiving fragments of information. A puzzle was forming, but pieces were missing. Then a report, a chilling report from a scout plane, the sighting of an American naval force, possibly a carrier. The information was vague, maddeningly so. Was it a carrier or just a cruiser group? The report didn't say. Nagumo faced a devil's choice. His bombers returning from Midway were low on fuel and ammunition. They needed to land. His deck was also half loaded with bombs meant for a second strike on the island's stubborn defenses. To attack the American ships, he needed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. That meant changing the ordnance on every single waiting aircraft, a backbreaking, time-consuming task. He hesitated. The gap opened here, too, thousands of miles from Brickman's shack. He gave the fateful order, prepare the aircraft on the flight deck for a second strike on Midway. The armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes would have to wait. The island was the known target. The American carrier was still just a ghost in a scout's transmission, for now. The American fighters, led by Major Floyd Parks, met the Japanese wave at 7:05. They were too low. They hadn't had time to climb. The sleek, deadly Zeros dove out of the sun and cut through them like a scythe. The Japanese formation, undisturbed, tightened up and began its run on the island. Jack and Brickman watched from a sandbagged command post now, the radar shack abandoned. The first bomb hit at 7:15. Then the world dissolved into noise and fire. Geysers of sand and steel. A fuel depot bloomed into an oily black rose. Hangars folded like cardboard. Through the slit in the sandbags, Jack saw a man running, then not running, just a shape on the ground. The math in his head stopped. This wasn't data. This was sand and blood and the smell of burning rubber. Brickman watched, his face stone. "My God," he breathed, not in prayer, but in cold accounting. He saw the direct cost of his hesitation. The fighters that could have met the enemy high were gone. The defense was brave, but it was from the knees. Yet through the smoke, a miracle. The airfield held. The runways, though cratered, were patched with frantic speed. The anti-aircraft guns kept chattering. The island, bloodied and burning, was still a functioning trap. And out there, unseen, McCluskey's lost bombers droned on, and Nagumo's deck crews swarmed over their aircraft, wrenching bombs off and on again in a frenzy of confused orders. Wade McCluskey saw it at 9:55 a.m. A lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming hell for leather to the northeast. A single ship, a needle in the ocean. Why was it going so fast? McCluskey made his second gut decision of the day. He turned his dying squadron to follow the ship's wake. It was a trail of breadcrumbs on the water. 10 minutes later, at the horizon's edge, he saw them. The entire Japanese carrier strike force spread out like toys on a blue blanket, and no combat air patrol above them. The Zeros were all down low, having finished off Parks's fighters, and now milling, waiting for their floating homes to be ready to receive them. It was 10:05. On the deck of the Akagi, the rearming operation was a chaotic ballet of bombs and torpedoes. The deck was a forest of parked planes, fueled and armed, a perfect stationary target. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He didn't have the fuel for it. He split his squadron, pointed at the two nearest carriers, and nosed over into his dive. The scream of the Dauntless was the first warning the Japanese had. By then, it was too late.
Back on Midway, a radio man whooped, leaping from his stool, tearing off his headset. "They got 'em! Enterprise and Yorktown! The dive bombers! They've hit the carriers! Multiple hits!" The command post erupted. Men shouted, hugged, cried. A major threw his hat at the ceiling. Brickman sagged against the sandbags, a profound exhaustion washing over him. The gamble, Nimitz's incredible, desperate gamble, had paid off. They'd won. The ghost of Pearl was finally, truly exorcised. Jack didn't celebrate. He was calculating. He looked at Brickman, then out at the smoking wreckage of the hangar where he'd eaten breakfast, at the stains in the sand that weren't there before. "We got them at 10:22, Jack said, his voice flat over the celebrating. Brickman looked at him, uncomprehending, a smile still dying on his lips. The American strike, the fatal one, it hit at 10:22. Our initial contact was at 5:52. Silence settled between them, a new gap, wider and deeper than the first. "What's your point, Ensign?" Brickman's voice was tired. 4 hours and 30 minutes, Jack said softly, his eyes not on his commander, but on the scope in his mind. "We gave them back 10 minutes of grace, with a signal they never saw and never recovered from." The celebration outside continued, the joy raw and real. The Battle of Midway was over. The turning point of the Pacific War had been reached. America had won. But in that sandbagged hole, two men understood a darker, quieter truth. Victory was not a clean line. It was a ragged stitch, sewn through layers of mistake and hesitation on both sides. A pilot's guess, an admiral's pause, an officer's ghost. The signal had been sent at 5:52. It had been received. And in the vast, curious silence between the sending and the acting, in the gaps filled with doubt and ghosts and gut feelings, history had turned, not on a sword's edge, but on the breath of a moment. A few gallons of fuel, a single speeding destroyer, and a blip on a green screen that was waited on just a little too long. A moment they would now carry, alone, forever.